Guys, Nathaniel here. I'm in Times Square in New York City. Now, I've done a lot of videos about Times Square, but this is where my hangout spot is, but I haven't done a video about why Times Square is the place that it is. Times Square got its starts from very humble beginnings. Its original name was called Long Acre Square. Now, the reason why it was called Long Acre Square is that in London, the place where they made all the buggies for the horse-drawn buggies was a place called Long Acre. And in Manhattan, the place in Manhattan where they made these same type of buggies was this area, therefore known as Long Acre Square. They just copied the name from London. The Americans did the same thing with a lot of places. Boston gets its name by a thing in Britain. Everything in New York basically is named after someone in either in the Netherlands, this is New Amsterdam, or London or England. It's the America's really boring when it comes to how they name things or why they name things and what they name them. So Long Acre Square gets its start very humbly from a developer trying to build small brick buildings up here, thinking there's a room for growth in the new uptown area of Manhattan. A lot of this area here in the mid 1800s is still mostly farmland. It's still mostly rural. Harlem actually used to be mostly farming. In fact, Thomas Jefferson actually had a farm up there in Harlem. So most of Manhattan was either a swamp or farmland. Long Acre Square remained Long Acre Square until this building you see right behind me. That's one Times Square. That's that's where the building that a guy by the name of Ox. He's the first generation from two German immigrants who ran the New York Times. He moved the New York Times up to that building in 1904. That same year, the subway was getting ready to open, and he lobbied the mayor of New York to bring the subway uptown this far to that building and to allow people to come into this building, which also helped development of the area. Long Acre Square's name was changed to Times Square in 1904. And to celebrate the building, on December 31st, 1804, the founder of the building had a huge fireworks display welcoming the year 1905. This celebration is continued every year, and that's why New York's Times Square has this history of having these huge New Year's Eve celebrations. Now, the ball drop has a little bit of history in noon. Not every city in the region has noon at the exact same time of day. So a lot of towns would have these balls that would raise up. That's how you tell if it was in the morning or if it was afternoon, because it would raise up to high noon. That's when the ball would be at the top. The term we get high noon is from the ball going up that pole. Now we celebrate the ball going down from one year into another one. And so that's kind of the history of why the ball is there and why the ball is a thing. Celebration has gone on every year since 1904 and the opening of the metro station. Times Square has had some pretty shady history. Back in the 1890s, actually a little bit before that, Times Square had a lot of brothels. It had its own red light district. There are also people trying to bring theater up here. So you had theater and brothels within a block of each other. Times Square kept its dangerous reputation periodically through its history. And actually in the year 1981, which was the most violent year in New York history, Times Square was one of the most dangerous places in the world to be. Since then, it has greatly cleaned up, especially due to mayors like Ed Koch and Rudy Giuliani cleaned up Times Square quite significantly. It has had some adverse effects, like Times Square and Broadway is now really becoming like a Walt Disney. Hi guys, you're on video. So there's been some cultural things about it that people are like, well, yeah, but we lost all of our culture. Yeah, but there's not so many muggings either. So that's cool. But yeah, and so all this stuff here, obviously all the lights behind me. Most places in the world, like they have city ordinances. In New York specifically, like lights are only allowed to be so bright. There's an ordinance for luminosity. In this area, the Times Square area, it's actually an ordinance that your lights have to be so bright or you get a fine. So that's the reason why it's so bright. Now, being a newspaper, there was a lot of reasons to advertise in the area. So advertising started in Times Square quite modestly, but it became a tourist attraction because of, one, the brothels, two, to see all the bright lights, that were being there to advertise to people. So people would come to the bright lights, therefore they added more bright lights because they wanted to advertise to more people, which fed more people to coming to Times Square to see the lights, which were then advertising to them, so they had to put more lights for more advertising. A couple of interesting things. This McDonald's here behind me is actually one of the original McDonald's, the guy who owned all the original McDonald's in New York City. That's his last holding. And that McDonald's is actually rumored to be closing. Apple is going to be replacing that McDonald's here in the next few years. So that icon in Times Square will be leaving, sadly, unless something changes and the deal falls through. But I'm pretty sure from the word on the street is that the money's changed hands, the lease is going to end, and then McDonald's is going to be closing. But there's other McDonald's. There's actually one on 42nd Street, which I'm coming to next. Times Square, when they named all the highways, when they're building the highways throughout the early 20th century, the Lincoln Highway starts in 42nd Street in Times Square and heads west and goes all the way out to California, where actually it intersects the Thomas Jefferson Highway in Ames, Iowa. So that's where Jefferson and Lincoln were names of states they kept trying to get past, but never could. But they did get they did get highways, Lincoln Highway and the Jefferson Highway, which were then removed when Eisenhower built in the interstate system. But that's another story for another day. So that's Times Square. That's basically why we have the celebrations on New Year's. That's why it got its name, Times Square. There's a lot of really interesting things here. After the World Trade Center attacks, a lot of the financial districts had to leave the financial area, and so they came to Times Square. Lehman Brothers, which is now the Barclays, is just over here about a block north of where I am at on Broadway. Morgan Stanley is on this side of me. I'm not going to turn the camera around because it's going to be a hassle. But a lot of the financial district buildings and the companies are now based out of Times Square. People don't know that. Another big change started in the early 2010s when what you see behind me, this is a lot more, there's all these people walking around. There's now a pedestrian plaza in Times Square that used to be Broadway. So Broadway, which was a road that drives through most of Manhattan, used to be a lane of travel. But Bloomberg wanted to alleviate some of the pedestrian traffic on the sidewalks, and so he put in this temporary pedestrian plaza with chairs and seating, and it's going to be temporary to see how it played out. It ended up working out pretty well, and they were able to market space for rent for little food carts, and now they serve alcohol.
Welcome to New York City!
Welcome to New York! And so that's why we have the this whole area is now a pedestrian plaza. And Bloomberg did announce that they were going to make this permanent. So Broadway now no longer goes all the way through Times Square, but you can still drive through down 7th Avenue. If you want to get a picture of your car driving through Times Square, it can still be done. So that's Times Square. Hope everyone's doing well. I'm going to get out of here. So until next time, guys, peace out.